Frontier chaos and the rise of the Harpes. A land without order. The closing years of the 18th century were some of the bloodiest and most lawless in American history. The Revolutionary War had ended, but the young United States was far from stable. The government was fragile, the western frontier was expanding rapidly, and settlers streamed into territories like Kentucky and Tennessee, carving out homes from wilderness that was still contested by native tribes and roving outlaws. These frontier lands were fertile but dangerous. Families traveled in wagons along narrow dirt trails, rivers, and through deep forests where the nearest neighbor might be 20 miles away. Law enforcement barely existed, sheriffs were rare, courts were distant, and most communities depended on vigilance committees or militias for justice. It was a place where violence could erupt at any time, and where killers could vanish into the woods with ease. It was in this climate of chaos that two brothers, Micajah, Big Harp, and Wiley, Little Harp, emerged as the most feared killers of their age. They were not just criminals, but predators who seemed to take pleasure in slaughter, carving their names into history as America's first true serial killers. The mystery of their origins. The Harpe brothers' exact origins remain clouded in uncertainty, with legends surrounding their early lives. Most accounts suggest that they were born in North Carolina around the 1760s or early 1770s. Their real surname may not have even been Harpe. Some historians believe they may have been born Harper, or that Harpe was an alias adopted later. What is clear is that they grew up in a violent world. The American Revolution tore families and communities apart, and the Harpes' family background placed them in conflict. Some stories suggest their family were loyalists, those who sided with the British crown, making them enemies of their patriot neighbors. Others claim the brothers' father was killed during the war, either by patriots or native warriors. Whatever the truth, the Harpes grew up with hatred in their hearts and vengeance in their blood. From an early age, Micajah and Wiley showed a taste for cruelty. Micajah, the elder and larger of the two, earned the nickname Big Harp for his massive size and strength. Wiley, leaner but equally vicious, became known as Little Harp. Together they developed a bond that was less like normal brotherhood and more like a pact of blood, united in violence and destruction. Early crimes and first raids. During the Revolution, many young men turned to raiding and plundering. The Harpes were no different, but while some fought for cause or survival, the brothers seemed motivated by bloodlust. They reportedly joined a Tory loyalist raiding party and took part in attacks against patriot farms, burning houses, stealing livestock, and murdering settlers. After the war ended in 1783, while other raiders faded back into obscurity, the Harpes continued their violent ways. They drifted through North Carolina, then into Virginia and the Kentucky frontier, committing thefts, assaults, and murders along the way. Unlike highwaymen who killed for money, the Harpes' crimes were marked by savagery that shocked even the rough frontier folk. Life with wives. By the late 1780s or early 1790s, the Harpes began traveling with women who were either kidnapped or forced into a strange family arrangement. Accounts vary, but most suggest they had 3 women, Susan, Maria, and Betsy, who lived with them as wives. Some historians believe at least 2 of these women were abducted as teenagers. The women's lives were ones of terror and control. They traveled with the brothers through dense forests, living in rough cabins or camps. The Harpes forced them into submission, and children were born into this twisted household. The women were often beaten, threatened, and humiliated, though later testimony suggested they sometimes aided the Harpes to survive. This strange domestic life added to the Harpes' aura of menace. Settlers whispered of the wild outlaw camp, where brutal men and captive women lived like wolves in the wilderness. First blood on the frontier trails. By the early 1790s, the Harpes had fully embraced a life of murder. They targeted travelers along the Wilderness Trail, the main road connecting Virginia and Kentucky, and later spread their terror into Tennessee. At first they killed for plunder, ambushing small groups or lone travelers. But quickly, a pattern emerged. They often murdered even when there was no gain. One tale describes how they butchered a man simply because his snoring irritated them at night. Another account says they killed a hungry settler who begged for food, not to rob him but for sport. The Harps developed a reputation for butchery rather than banditry. Victims were often hacked apart with knives, bludgeoned with tomahawks, or drowned in rivers. Their crimes were not just killings, they were displays of cruelty. Reputation spreads fear. By the mid-1790s, the Harps name spread across Kentucky and Tennessee like a dark legend. Settlers passing through whispered of two great monsters who murdered without mercy. In a world already full of dangers from wolves, starvation, and Indian raids, the idea of killers who struck randomly made frontier life even more terrifying. Unlike other criminals who preyed on the wealthy, the Harps killed anyone: men, women, children, even infants. Their unpredictability made them impossible to ignore. Reports of their crimes began appearing in frontier newspapers, though often exaggerated or based on rumor. Still, the tales painted a picture of savage brothers roaming free in the wilderness, a reminder that civilization had only a fragile grip on the frontier. The spark of frontier justice. Communities along the Wilderness Trail and in Tennessee began organizing militias and posses to track the Harps down. But the brothers were skilled at survival. They knew how to navigate forests, rivers, and mountains. They could vanish into the wilderness for weeks, living off stolen food or wild game. Every time a posse seemed close, the Harps slipped away, leaving behind more bodies as they fled. The pursuit only seemed to fuel their rage, as if each manhunt provoked them to kill even more brutally. By the end of the decade, the Harps had become more than criminals. They were frontier bogeymen, names spoken with fear around campfires. Parents warned children about them, and travelers prayed not to encounter them on lonely trails. Conclusion of Part 1. The world that birthed the Harpe Brothers was a perfect storm: lawless frontier, fractured families after the Revolution, and endless opportunities for violence. From their uncertain origins in North Carolina to their bloody arrival in Kentucky and Tennessee, the Harps quickly escalated from raiders to sadistic murderers. They were unlike anything early America had seen. While other outlaws stole horses or robbed wagons, the Harps seemed to kill for pleasure. Their reign of terror was only beginning, and soon the trails of the frontier would be littered with their victims, the trail of terror. The murderous pattern emerges. By the mid-1790s, the Harpe brothers had fully transformed into something beyond outlaws. They were no longer simply raiding for supplies or seeking revenge for past grievances. Instead, they appeared to kill because they wanted to, because it gave them pleasure. The frontier, with its endless forests and isolated trails, gave them the perfect hunting ground. Families traveling west in wagons, lone horsemen, farmers moving livestock, and even settlers camping overnight became potential victims. Unlike professional highwaymen, who usually robbed and only killed when resisted, the Harps often murdered without any financial motive. This made them far more terrifying than bandits. In the minds of settlers, the Harps were not just criminals, they were predators, wolves dressed as men, roaming the frontier. The butchered traveler. One of the earliest stories that spread across Kentucky concerned a man traveling alone who made the mistake of joining the Harps' camp for a night. Accounts vary, but most suggest he was a harmless farmer on his way home. That night, as the man slept, he began to snore loudly. The sound irritated Big Harp, who grew furious at the noise. Rather than ignore it or move, Big Harp quietly took up his tomahawk and split the man's skull as he lay sleeping. The act shocked even those who would later recount the tale. There was no robbery involved. The man had little of value. He was killed for nothing more than making an annoying sound. This incident marked the Harpes as killers without reason, a theme that would define their bloody career. Families slaughtered. The Harpes rarely limited themselves to single travelers. On several occasions, they attacked entire families. One such story tells of a settler family moving westward with children in tow. The Harpes offered to escort them through dangerous territory. Instead, once they were deep in the wilderness, the brothers murdered the parents and at least one of the children. Another account speaks of a baby killed simply because its cries disturbed Big Harp. He reportedly lifted the infant by the heels and smashed its head against a tree. Even in an age of frequent violence, such acts horrified people. Killing men in a fight was one thing, murdering women and children for no reason was another. The Harpes' reputation grew darker with each retelling, until they seemed less like human beings and more like demons wandering the wilderness. Killing their own companions. The Harpes' bloodlust extended even to their fellow criminals. From time to time, they traveled with other outlaws or small gangs, but often disputes or even minor annoyances ended with the Harpes murdering their own allies. One story describes how they killed a fellow bandit who simply refused to share food. Another time, they murdered a companion because he questioned their leadership. Again, there was no robbery involved, only blood. These killings made the Harpes feared even among criminals. Few men dared to partner with them for long, knowing that the slightest disagreement could mean a tomahawk in the skull. Murders along the Wilderness Trail. As settlers continued to push westward, the Wilderness Trail became one of the main arteries of migration. It also became the Harpes' killing ground. Travelers began to vanish with alarming frequency. Sometimes their bodies were found by the roadside, mutilated and left for animals to scavenge. Other times, entire families disappeared, their wagons later discovered burned or abandoned. The Harpes became experts at blending in. They often presented themselves as fellow travelers, friendly and willing to guide strangers through dangerous territory. Once trust was gained, betrayal soon followed. A disturbing ritual. Witness accounts and later testimonies from their captured wives suggested that the Harpes sometimes killed as a form of ritualistic release. After days without bloodshed, Big Harp especially grew restless and irritable. He would pace, grow angry over small matters, and finally insist that they needed to kill something. Once a victim was chosen and murdered, his mood lifted. He became calm again, almost cheerful. This chilling pattern painted him as not merely violent, but as a man addicted to killing, compelled to shed blood in order to maintain his own twisted sense of balance. Innocent strangers fall. The brothers' list of victims included dozens of people, though exact numbers are debated. Some were travelers on horseback, others were farmers walking alone. A few names survived in court records or newspaper reports. Major John Love, a Revolutionary War veteran traveling home, was found murdered along a trail. James Brassel, a farmer, was killed while tending his field. John Tully, a settler, was found slain after sharing a camp with the Harpes. A young boy was drowned in a river, weighted with stones. Many others remain nameless, their stories lost to time, but believed to number well over 30 by the time the Harpes' spree ended. Frontier fear grows. By the late 1790s, communities in Kentucky and Tennessee were gripped with terror. Rumors of the Harpes spread faster than news could be confirmed. Travelers carried weapons and refused to camp with strangers. Mothers hushed their children at night with warnings that the Harpes will come if you don't sleep. Some settlers compared the brothers to wild animals. But unlike wolves or bears, the Harpes seemed to kill for amusement, leaving corpses scattered like gruesome trophies. Even native tribes, who were often blamed for frontier violence, began pointing fingers at the Harpes, insisting that such cruelty could not be their doing. The brothers had become infamous, known across the region as human monsters. The role of Kate and the wives. Traveling with the Harpes were three women, often identified as Susan, Maria, and Betsy. Accounts suggest that at least two were abducted, while one may have joined voluntarily. They were forced into the role of wives, bearing children and living under constant threat of death. Survivors later reported that the women sometimes lured travelers into the Harpes camp, pretending to need assistance or companionship. Once a victim let down his guard, the brothers would strike. These women lived in terror, but they also became witnesses to the horrors the Harpes committed. Later, after the downfall of the brothers, their testimonies would provide some of the clearest insight into the killers' private lives. Killing for no reason. One of the most shocking aspects of the Harpes' spree was the lack of logic behind their crimes. When bandits attacked, people at least understood the motive: money, food, or supplies. But with the Harpes, the motive was often absent. A man might be murdered for snoring, a baby killed for crying, a farmer slaughtered for failing to step off the trail quickly enough. These senseless killings instilled a special kind of terror because they proved that anyone could be a target at any time. The Harpes did not discriminate. Their victims ranged from wealthy travelers to poor farmers, men, women, and children alike. A growing trail of corpses. By 1798, reports of the Harpes' murders reached alarming numbers. Some historians estimate they killed at least 30 people, though others believe the number may have been double. Each killing added to their legend, and each corpse discovered along the trails made communities more desperate for justice. But catching the brothers proved nearly impossible. They moved constantly, camping deep in the woods, and relied on terror to keep locals silent. Still, the walls were beginning to close in. The brothers' recklessness was catching up with them, and the frontier community, tired of death and fear, would soon take action. Conclusion of Part 2. The Harpe Brothers' bloody trail was unlike anything America had yet seen. They were not just criminals or outlaws, but serial killers before the term even existed. Their cruelty shocked the frontier, and their murders created an atmosphere of dread wherever they roamed. But as their body count rose, so too did the determination of settlers to stop them. Posse after posse formed, searching the woods, hunting for the two brothers who had turned the frontier into their killing ground. The stage was set for a clash between the Harpes and the communities that had suffered their reign of terror. The frontier hunts begin. Blood on the Wilderness Trail. By 1798, the killings attributed to the Harpe brothers had become impossible to ignore. From Kentucky to Tennessee, travelers went missing. Wagons were abandoned and bodies turned up in rivers, forests, and roadside ditches. The Wilderness Trail, once a symbol of westward hope, was now stained with fear. Settlers had always known dangers lurked in the wilderness: wild animals, hunger, Indian attacks, but human predators like the Harpes were different. Wolves killed for food. The Harpes killed for satisfaction. Families traveling westward began carrying extra weapons, forming larger caravans, and refusing to share camps with strangers. Still, the Harpes thrived in the chaos. Every posse formed to catch them seemed to return empty-handed, and every failed hunt only deepened their legend as men who could vanish into the forests like shadows. The murder of Major Love. One of the killings that truly shook the region was the murder of Major John Love, a Revolutionary War veteran and respected settler. Love had served his country with honor and was considered a pillar of his community. While traveling home along the Kentucky wilderness paths, he crossed paths with the Harpes. Reports say they initially greeted him as fellow travelers, but by nightfall he was dead, hacked to death and left by the trail. When Love's body was discovered, outrage spread through Kentucky. This was not just another nameless traveler. This was a man with a reputation, a veteran whose death demanded justice. For the first time, the authorities began to treat the Harpes not merely as nuisances, but as a serious threat to order on the frontier. The drowned boy. Another murder that inflamed public anger was that of a young boy. The Harpes captured him. Some accounts suggest he was around 13 or 14 years old, and rather than release him, they drowned him in a river, weighing his body down with stones. The senselessness of this killing shocked even hardened frontiersmen. The boy had no wealth, posed no threat, and offered no resistance. His only crime was encountering the Harpes at the wrong time. The discovery of his body sent waves of anger through nearby communities. By this point, settlers were not just afraid of the Harpes, they were furious. The brothers were becoming enemies of all decent people, and the call for vengeance grew louder. The women's silent suffering. Meanwhile, the three women traveling with the Harpes, Susan, Maria, and Betsy, endured a life of terror. Forced to follow the brothers through wilderness camps, they often had to watch as murders unfolded. Sometimes they were made to help lure victims or dispose of stolen goods. The women bore children during this period, though their fates were grim. Big Harp, in particular, had no patience for crying infants. In one of the most horrifying accounts, when one of the bobbies would not stop crying, he seized the child, declaring he would put it out of its misery. He smashed the infant's skull against a tree. Even among outlaws, such an act was beyond comprehension. The women lived under constant threat. Not only could strangers be killed at any moment, but their own children were not safe. The wilderness manhunts. The settlers had had enough. Posse after posse was raised to track the Harpes. Armed men combed the forests, scouted riverbanks, and followed reports of sightings. Yet time and again, the brothers slipped away. They were masters of survival. They knew how to build hidden camps, how to double back on their trails, and how to intimidate witnesses into silence. Some settlers who encountered them later admitted they had been too frightened to report the meeting. To cross the Harpes and fail meant almost certain death. But the manhunts kept growing. Each killing only brought more men to the cause, and gradually the circle began to tighten. The terrifying reputation of Big Harp. Of the two brothers, Big Harp became the most feared. Standing over 6 feet tall and weighing close to 200 pounds, he was an intimidating figure. His strength was legendary, and he seemed to revel in displays of brute violence. Survivors later described him as cold and calculating, capable of sudden, explosive rage. Unlike robbers who might threaten but spare lives, Big Harp almost always pushed for death. His philosophy, if it could be called that, was simple: dead men told no tales. But more than that, he seemed to enjoy killing. While Little Harp also murdered, it was Big Harp who had the reputation of taking pleasure in cruelty, of laughing while striking victims down, of boasting about how many he had killed. Terror at the settlers' cabins. The Harpes did not always wait for travelers. Sometimes they attacked settlers in their homes. One such story tells of a family sheltering the Harpes overnight. In the morning, instead of thanking their hosts, the brothers murdered the entire household. Neighbors later found the cabin ransacked, the family slaughtered, and blood spattered on the walls. These attacks spread panic across the frontier. No one knew if the strangers they welcomed into their homes were simple travelers or wolves in human form. Trust between settlers, a necessary bond for survival, began to erode. The massacre near Knoxville. In Tennessee, the Harpes committed one of their most infamous crimes. A group of travelers, including men, women, and children, disappeared along the road near Knoxville. Days later, searchers discovered their bodies, brutally mutilated. The details were so grotesque that newspapers of the time struggled to describe them. Reports spoke of scalping, dismemberment, and corpses left to rot in open fields. The massacre stunned Knoxville. The town had already heard of the Harpes, but this atrocity confirmed them as something beyond human criminals. The people of Tennessee declared war on the brothers, and militia units joined the hunt. The frontier closes in. By 1799, The Harpes were among the most wanted men in the frontier. Their names were cursed in Kentucky taverns, whispered in Tennessee cabins, and printed in early newspapers that carried reports of their savagery. The Tennessee governor even placed a bounty on their heads, dead or alive. Posters promised cash for anyone who could deliver them to justice. The Harpes mocked these efforts, continuing to kill as they fled deeper into the wilderness. But their world was shrinking. With every posse and every murder, the frontier grew less forgiving. The Harpes' hideouts. The brothers relied on remote camps in the forests and mountains, often near rivers. They moved frequently, building rough shelters of logs and brush. Sometimes they stayed in caves, hidden from view. Locals claimed they could travel for weeks without contact, living off stolen supplies or game. When they re-emerged, it was often to strike again. But the wilderness could not protect them forever. Posses were learning their patterns, and their wives, weary of endless violence, were beginning to consider escape. Conclusion of Part 3. The late 1790s were a turning point. The Harpe brothers had moved from being whispered bogeymen to officially hunted outlaws. Their list of murders, men, women, children, even their own infants, had sparked a fire in the frontier communities. Though still elusive, the Harpes could no longer rely on fear alone. Posses were forming, governors were offering bounties, and settlers were no longer willing to let the killers roam free. The trail of blood they left behind would soon lead to their downfall, the fall of the Harpes. A trail of fire and fear. By 1799, the Harpe brothers' reign of terror had reached its breaking point. They had murdered dozens of men, women, and children across Kentucky and Tennessee. They had slaughtered travelers on the road, massacred families in their homes, and terrorized entire communities. But every murder brought them closer to the end. Word of their atrocities spread like wildfire through towns, settlements, and military outposts. The stories grew darker and more grotesque. Bobbies dashed against trees, bodies hacked apart, and corpses left to rot in rivers. These weren't just crimes, they were acts that demanded vengeance. And finally, vengeance came. The murder of James Brassell's family. One of the final sparks that sealed the Harpes. Fate came when they murdered a settler named James Brassell and his family in Kentucky. Brassell was a farmer who lived along the frontier trail with his wife and young children. The Harpes, claiming to be weary travelers, asked for shelter. Brassell, like many good-hearted settlers, welcomed them into his home. By dawn, his family was dead. Reports said the Harpes killed Brassell, his wife, and several of his children, hacking them apart and leaving their bodies scattered around the cabin. When neighbors discovered the scene, the horror ignited fury across the county. This was not the death of strangers or lone travelers. This was a family, murdered in their own home in the heart of a community. Word spread quickly, and within days a posse of armed men assembled. Their mission was simple: hunt down the Harpes and kill them. Big Harp's last rampage. Knowing that the net was tightening, the Harpes fled the Brassell farm and took to the wilderness once again. But Big Harp, perhaps out of arrogance or bloodlust, couldn't resist one last act of violence. Along the road near Henderson County, Kentucky, he encountered a young settler woman named Mrs. Stegall. He convinced her husband to let him stay overnight in their cabin. But before dawn, Big Harp struck. He murdered the Stegall's infant child, smashing its head against a wall when it cried. Then, when Mrs. Stegall screamed in terror, he stabbed her repeatedly and set the cabin ablaze. This final atrocity, the killing of a helpless baby and mother in such a brutal fashion, was too much. News raced across the frontier. The posse now swelled with furious men, determined that Big Harp would never leave the wilderness alive. The pursuit through the wilderness. The manhunt that followed was relentless. The posse tracked the Harpes across rivers, through dense forests, and into rugged hills. Armed settlers, many of whom had lost friends or relatives to the killers, pursued them with a single-minded purpose. Big Harp, knowing he was being hunted, moved quickly, but his brutality had slowed him down. His wives were exhausted, carrying children and supplies through the wilderness. The cries of the children gave away their position more than once. Finally, near the Green River in Kentucky, the posse caught up. The end of Big Harp. The settlers surrounded Big Harp, cutting off his escape. Shots rang out. Big Harp was struck by a bullet in the leg and fell from his horse. The men rushed in, furious and unrelenting. They demanded to know why he had killed so many innocents. Big Harp, even bleeding and cornered, showed no remorse. Some accounts say he confessed to killing more than 40 people, not counting those his brother murdered. Others claim he laughed at his captors, declaring that death meant nothing to him. But death did come. According to legend, one of the men whose family Big Harp had destroyed, possibly the father of Mrs. Stegall, demanded the right to finish him. In a moment of brutal frontier justice, he slowly cut off Big Harp's head while the outlaw was still alive. Big Harp's decapitated head was taken to a crossroads in Kentucky and mounted on a tall post as a warning to others. For years, the site was known as Harp's Head, a grim reminder of the frontier's darkest predator. The capture of the Harpe women. When Big Harp was killed, the 3 women traveling with the brothers, Susan, Maria, and Betsy, were captured. The frontier community faced a dilemma. Were they willing accomplices or victims forced into servitude? Some settlers wanted them punished, arguing they had helped lure men into traps or had benefited from stolen goods. Others saw them as prisoners who had suffered under the Harpes' cruelty. Ultimately, the women were released. They returned to relatives or found new lives, though forever marked by their association with the killers. The fate of their children, however, remains murky in history. Little Harp on the run. Unlike Big Harp, Little Harp managed to escape during the final confrontation. He fled into the wilderness, determined to survive. For years, he disappeared from the frontier record, hiding among criminals and outlaws. But his story was not over. While Big Harp's reign ended in blood and fire, Little Harp would resurface in an unexpected way, aligning himself with other killers and eventually facing justice in a more public spectacle. The frontier breathes again. When word spread that Big Harp was dead, relief swept across Kentucky and Tennessee. Farmers, settlers, and travelers finally felt they could sleep at night without fear of being butchered in their beds. But the scars remained. Families remembered the horrors, neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the murders, and parents frightened children with tales of the Harpes in the woods. The story of the Harpes became a kind of frontier folklore, a warning about trust, hospitality, and the thin line between civilization and savagery. The bloody legacy. Historians today consider Big Harp and Little Harp to be America's first true serial killers. Unlike bandits who robbed out of necessity, or feuding families who killed over grudges, the Harpes murdered indiscriminately. Their victims were not just enemies, but anyone they encountered: strangers on the road, women and children, even their own offspring. Their cruelty was shocking even by frontier standards, where life was often brutal and short. In many ways, the Harpes revealed the darker side of the American frontier, a world where law was scarce, where justice was often carried out by the gun or blade, and where some men thrived on blood instead of survival. Conclusion of Part 4. With Big Harp's death, the frontier saw the end of its most feared predator. His head on a pike served as bot. The legacy of the bloody Harpes. The shadow of Little Harp. When Big Harp's severed head was mounted on a pike at a Kentucky crossroads in 1799, many thought the nightmare had ended. But one figure still haunted the frontier: Wiley Harpe, known as Little Harp. Unlike his hulking brother, Little Harp was cunning, quiet, and far more careful. He knew that the law and armed settlers were hunting him, so he vanished into the wilderness. For a time, his name was spoken in whispers, settlers unsure if he lived or had fled across the frontier. But the shadow of his crimes lingered. Everyone knew he was out there, and as the years passed, little Harpe would resurface in a way that shocked even those familiar with the Harps' cruelty. A new identity among outlaws. After disappearing from Kentucky and Tennessee, little Harpe sought refuge among the criminal underworld of the frontier. America was growing, but large stretches of land were still lawless. Outlaws, horse thieves, counterfeiters, and river pirates thrived in these regions, particularly along the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. Little Harpe fit right in. He found new companions in crime and learned to move under assumed names. For years, he avoided recognition, even as frontier newspapers occasionally published warnings that Wiley Harpe, the murderer, may yet live. Eventually, his path crossed with another notorious figure of frontier crime, Samuel Mason. Samuel Mason and the River Pirates. Samuel Mason was a Revolutionary War veteran turned criminal. By the early 1800s, he led a band of outlaws operating along the Mississippi River, headquartered at a place known as Cave-in Rock in southern Illinois. Cave-in Rock was a natural fortress, a giant cavern along the river where bandits could hide stolen goods, counterfeit money, and plan ambushes on travelers. Mason's gang specialized in piracy, luring flatboats to shore under false pretenses, then robbing and killing the crews. To little Harpe, Mason's gang was a perfect place to vanish. Here, he could blend into a crowd of thieves, living as he always had by violence and crime. The betrayal of Samuel Mason. But little Harpe was not just another outlaw. He was ruthless, ambitious, and above all, a survivor. In 1804, the U.S. government finally cracked down on Mason's gang. Mason himself was captured and taken into custody in Mississippi. Somehow, he managed to escape, but before long, he was recaptured by bounty hunters and imprisoned in Arkansas Territory. Little Harpe saw an opportunity. The government had placed a reward on Mason's head, dead or alive. To escape his own past and perhaps buy leniency for his crimes, little Harpe decided on a shocking betrayal. With an accomplice named Peter Alston, a counterfeiter, little Harpe murdered Samuel Mason. They cut off Mason's head and carried it to authorities, claiming the bounty. But justice was not fooled. The authorities recognized little Harpe and Alston as wanted criminals themselves. Instead of collecting the reward, they were arrested. The execution of little Harpe. Little Harpe's capture marked the final chapter in the bloody saga of the Harpe brothers. After years of terror, betrayal, and hiding, he was finally in the hands of the law. He was taken to Old Greenville, Mississippi Territory, where a gallows awaited him. The people, eager for vengeance, crowded to witness the end of the man who had haunted the frontier for so long. On February 8, 1804, little Harpe was executed by hanging alongside Peter Alston. Unlike his brother, he didn't die in a furious battle. He died quietly, a noose around his neck, the law finally catching up with him. The frontier breathed easier. The Harpe name, synonymous with terror, had finally come to an end. Counting the dead. Historians debate the true number of the Harpe brothers' victims. Some estimate at least 39 murders, while others argue the real number was likely much higher. Their victims included travelers along the wilderness road, innkeepers and settlers who showed them hospitality, entire families, including women and children, even their own children, murdered in fits of rage or annoyance. Unlike typical outlaws, the Harpes rarely killed for money or goods. In fact, they often left valuables untouched. Their killings seemed driven by cruelty, sadism, and an insatiable lust for blood. That's why they are remembered not as common bandits, but as America's first true serial killers. The frontier response. The Harpes' crimes changed how communities on the frontier viewed justice. Hospitality became dangerous. Settlers who once welcomed travelers into their homes now grew suspicious, fearing another Harp might appear at their door. Posse justice grew common. The law was thin on the ground, so ordinary men banded together to hunt down criminals. Vigilante justice became a defining feature of frontier life. Stories became legend. Parents warned children about the Harpes, using their names like bogeymen. "Behave or Big Harp will come for you" became a chilling refrain. Folklore and myth. Over time, the story of the Harpes entered American folklore. Writers and historians painted them as demons in human form. Their savagery stood out even in an age when violence was common. Some legends exaggerated their crimes, claiming they killed hundreds, or that Big Harp's head cursed the crossroads where it was displayed. Others romanticized them as tragic figures, outcasts of a cruel world, though most remembered them as monsters. The crossroads where Big Harp's head was displayed remained a landmark for decades, locals pointing to it as a place where justice had been served. Comparison with later killers. The Harpe Brothers predated America's most infamous killers by nearly a century. Long before Jack the Ripper haunted London or H.H. Holmes stalked Chicago, the Harpes were carving their bloody path across the frontier. Unlike later killers who sought fame, wealth, or twisted thrills, the Harpes seemed to kill simply because they enjoyed it. That makes them unique, not just outlaws but predators. Why their story still matters. Today, the tale of the Harpe Brothers endures because it represents something deeper about America's early days. The fragility of law, the darkness that lurked on the edge of civilization, and the price communities paid for survival. Their story is studied in criminology as an early example of serial killer psychology. Historians examine it as a lesson in frontier justice and the perils of lawless times, and true crime enthusiasts revisit it as a chilling reminder that violence is as old as America itself. Conclusion: the Bloody Harp's legacy. Micajah Big Harp died with his head on a pike. Wiley Little Harp died swinging from a rope. But their legend lives on. They are remembered not just for the dozens of innocent lives they destroyed, but for the terror they inspired across the frontier. They weren't soldiers fighting a war, nor bandits seeking gold. They were killers for killing's sake, predators who walked among ordinary settlers. And that is why, more than 2 centuries later, the Harpe Brothers are still called what they truly were: America's first serial killers.